somebody has to do it, by Juan Toledo. As with sport or even journalism, the arts take place in a world with a fair amount of jingoism. As a result, our artistic appreciations and our literary ones are full of one sided misconceptions and omissions. One of these misconceptions is that all Latin American literature is synonymous with magic realism, when in fact, its main exponent, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, wrote more historical novels than magic realist ones. One could even argue that Latin American readers have an advantage over those of the English speaking world in having no problem whatsoever understanding psychological and social charged dramas of Jane Austen, Dickens, or Martin Amis, or even those fantasy sagas full of the kind of magic which aspires to save the world, including Shakespeare's The Tempest, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, or more recently, Harry Potter. The same cannot be said of the average English reader, who tends to think of literature produced in Spanish across the Atlantic as all detached from reality, failing to understand that magic realism is, in reality, a social and historical critique. This is a misunderstanding which manifests itself in a lack of translations, an absence of literary discussions in the British press, or even obituaries of those of our most important writers. Even specialized publications, like the London Review of Books, offer very little when it comes to the diffusion of the ideas and themes appearing in contemporary Latin American fiction. The exception tends to be either a writer who fits the pre-existing model of how a successful English novel should be, or a novelist already translated and acclaimed in the United States. The other major contrast between Latin American and UK English literature is one of format. Whereas in Britain, for historical and commercial reasons, the novel as a literary form is king, in Latin America, some of our most admired and innovative writers never wrote a novel, preferring instead the innovation, irony, and refined humor of the short story. This is something which remains literally inconceivable on these shores of ours in Britain. My own transition from a student of science in Latin America to an undergraduate reading English literature and philosophy at UCL's Barber College, followed by a master in Hispanic studies, created in me a personal comparative study between the two great fictional traditions of British and Latin American literature. As a result, I felt the urgency of trying to generate, together with a small group of friends, a commentary, critique, and dissemination of books and ideas produced across the pond in Spanish, something which still at present remains virtually non-existent in Britain. The do-it-yourself approach to filling that void has always required nothing less than steadfastness. Before the globalized dissemination of the internet, my efforts consisted of editing the first Spanish-speaking newspaper in London, Crónica Latina, turning what was a community sheet for business advertising their trade into a monthly newspaper with opinion, interviews, and extended cultural sections, and even a crossword. Subsequently, I had the opportunity to edit a magazine, Pulso, that similarly was transformed into a quasi-cultural monthly, and which, to my advantage, I was hired to do. Together, Crónica Latina and Pulso was a labor of 7 years, reviewing books and films and interviewing such luminaries as Alberto Manguel, Roger Bartra, Javier Cerca, Silvia Libeninsky, Juan Manuel Roca, William Ospina, and Homero Arigis, the first poet ever to address the ecological dilemma in any Western language. With the help of some British Latin Americanists, such as William Rowe, Jason Wilson, and John Kaniaskas, contacts made possible through my postgraduate studies at Barber College in London, we were able to venture into British institutional spaces and present a slightly different perspective of Latin American literature and culture. Personal highlights at the time were a conference at the Institute of Latin American Studies about two philosophers, Stanislao Soleta, whose entire oeuvre has been recently re-edited, and Nicolas Gomez Davila, as well as a 4-night slot to talk on Nicky Campbell's BBC Radio 5 live show. Now that the ubiquitousness of the web has translated into wider access to global cultural productions, my efforts are focused on putting and keeping together a community of writers, critics, academics, and independent publishers, such as Friends of Alice, Victoria Press, and Equidistancias, to share their knowledge and enthusiasm for Latin American literature. Two outcomes have been CTR Radio London, a bilingual podcast, and Revista Perro Negro, the only cultural magazine that, as far as we are aware, is also bilingual. The magazine editorial credo is to have a free-to-access online publications written in a language that is at once intelligent, original, accessible, and even irreverent. Articles are published in either English or Spanish. We commission our own translations and help to present and disseminate work by lesser-known authors, both contemporary and non-contemporary. We have just started to publish our own books and translations in Ediciones Perro Negro. And after 8 years, we have been able to create what we call an immense minority of loyal worldwide readers and listeners keen to learn about the literary traditions of Latin America, and to a lesser extent, the English-speaking world, albeit from a different perspective. What we had witnessed after almost 4 decades of commenting and promoting Latin American literature is a significant shift of attention from narratives until recently equated with exoticisms and lo real maravilloso, to a more recent body of work encompassing outstanding imaginative and hard-hitting texts. These include Hurricane Seasons by Fernanda Melchor, Optic Nerve by Maria Gainza, the disquieting short stories of Samantha Schweblin, and historical reflections about cultural purity and identity as explored by UK-based writers like Enrique Satara or Carlos Fonseca. The latter is his extraordinary novel Austral. The Afro-Latin American novel is also starting to emerge alongside the narratives of indigenous cultures of the continent, with authors such as the Black Mayan artist Samaria Poyet starting to get recognition, and also Ruben Hillary, who writes in Aymara. The canvas in which Latinx writers wave their threads is definitely much larger, more colorful and polyphonic than ever. It seems that finally our globalized cosmic world is starting to be reflected on by us, and not the other way around.